Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. Just as a reminder for all of our episodes, while we love interviewing people who fall far from the norm and interrogating radical ideas, we do not necessarily endorse the views of our guests on this show.
In this episode, we interview Abeba Birhane, a PhD candidate in cognitive science at University College Dublin in the School of Computer Science. Abeba studies the relationships between emerging technologies, personhood, and society. Specifically, she explores how technology can shape what it means to be human. Abeba's work is interdisciplinary, bridging the fields of cognitive science, psychology, computer science, critical data studies, philosophy, and more.
Several questions that we explore in this interview. Should we grant robots rights? What is moral relationality, and how can it be useful for designing machine learning algorithms? And finally, what is the algorithmic colonization of Africa, and why is it harmful? Without further ado, we are so excited to share this interview with Abeba Birhane with all of you.
We're here with Abeba Birhane. Abeba, how are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. As we get started, we were wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself, about who you are as a person, maybe as a researcher.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with my academic background. I guess that's the easiest. I am from Ethiopia originally, and I first studied physics, and then I was failing in calculus, so I moved to study physics with languages. That was my first degree in Ethiopia, and I moved then to Ireland and totally switched to a completely new area, and I studied psychology and then philosophy. And then I went and did a master's in cognitive science. My mom is always complaining whenever I am on the phone, when will you stop studying? You are like studying forever. After my master's in cog sci, I kind of took a year out. I worked for an advertising agency. I didn't like it very much, but I was advised to kind of experience the real world, as they say, and then came back to do my PhD. I'm on my third year now, and
I'm really interested in how you started in cognitive science. I'm also interested in your answer to that question about whether you'll ever stop studying.
I totally. I guess I have a love and hate relationship with academia. I love reading, I love studying, I love discussing research with my peers. But I'm also constantly frustrated as a Black woman because there are so many barriers. Your work is way more scrutinized. You are made feel like an imposter constantly. Your students are, every semester you walk into your class and your students are surprised you are there to teach them. I guess people are not used to young Black women teaching in classrooms. But also generally, the kind of ingrained structure that takes the Western white man as the status quo, as the quintessential representative of academia, directly or indirectly is constantly frustrating because you are being excluded, being questioned, and you face various challenges. But despite that, I guess that's an ongoing tension. I still love reading, research, and I hate that aspect, but it's a push and pull, and it's hopefully I will find the perfect balance, which itself is a moving target. And Yeah, I started, I got into CogSci because I guess this was a few years back now. I really liked the interdisciplinary aspect of it, especially in Dublin, in Ireland, where I studied my master's, where I'm doing my PhD. The cognitive science program is super interdisciplinary. You do modules from neuroscience, from computer science, from philosophy, from anthropology. So it's really kind of gives you a great insight into various fields, and I really liked that aspect of that. The master's program in Dublin, Ireland, is very interdisciplinary. There were a few modules in computer science where you did various sorts of modeling, cognitive modeling. But apart from that, it really is a collection of, not just a collection, you also have to integrate them all into creating something coherent. But I got into, through the master's program, I come to this kind of narrow field in cognitive science known as embodied and inactive cognitive science. You are probably familiar with it. It's kind of a pushback against traditional thinking, traditional cognitive science, which in a nutshell takes cognition as something, separate or separable, something individualistic. You can look at the brain, or you can take the individual out of the ecology and put them in a lab and study their learning or their intelligence or their cognition. And it's a pushback against all that. It's like, no, the person is inherently and naturally interlinked with a web of relations with other person, but also with the physical environment as well. So if you want to understand a person's learning process or intelligence or cognition, you really have to take account of the whole milieu. You have to study people as active beings, as they interact. So that's the core of these embodied in inactive traditions. So I was very interested in that, and I came to so when I initially proposed to do a PhD, my initial research question was, yes, the person is inherently interlinked with others. You cannot exist without others. And also the environment is crucial. But within that paradigm, the embodied and inactive traditions don't focus so much on the digital aspect of the environment. So I came in to look in depth at how the digital sphere contributes to what it means to be a person, to what cognition is. So as I went further and further into my studies, what I discovered and what was really gripping my interest was the fact that, yes, everybody is impacted by the digital technology, whether it's something you voluntarily use, upload, or interact with, or whether it is, technologies that are out there installed and that you come in to interact with involuntarily, where you have no choice. Yes, everybody is impacted by that, and to some extent, it does affect how you react, how you behave, and how you become. But what's missing, what is not explored, is the fact that not everybody is impacted equally. The higher your position is in the societal hierarchy, the more agency you seem to have to choose what can influence you, what you can avoid, that sort of stuff. So that then ethics become incredibly unavoidable. You cannot study these aspects of cognition and what it means to be a person and not look at ethics. So now, near the end of my third year, I see myself more at the ethics side of CogSci rather than at the cognition part of CogSci where I started out.
A part of my research right now is even just trying to get a handle on the word ethics and what it means in some of these spaces. And I'm wondering for you, how do you define ethics, or like what do you think is the goal of like these ethical conversations in technology spaces?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Uh, on my Twitter bio, I used to have, I still have hashtags like uh, complexity, embodiment, dialogism, and ethics. And I recently took ethics out because it has become uh, kind of vacuous, and because it means so many things, so many different things to so many people. So uh, I I find myself kind of avoiding that word, and even though I just I mean, in the scale of where my study is in the in the landscape of CogSci, I do see myself more at the ethics side. Uh, but to pinpoint what exactly ethics means has become really problematic. I think the main reason to that comes down to, at least for me, to various ethics boards within various big tech companies where ethics has become just a PR stunt, uh, or you have this very narrow field of AI ethics where people are intensely working on finding a good formulation or the perfect formula to debias your data set, or to find a way to avoid discrimination, that sort of stuff. So it has become, in that sense, it has become so narrow. It's for me that yes, it's part of the solution, but it misses the bigger point, and uh, kind of associating ethics to that narrow idea, or to the general PR stunt being used by big companies. That's probably some of the reasons why I have come to try to stay away from that word.
Yeah. And part of, for me, what makes your research so influential is that you're bridging some of these disciplinary gaps. So, like, you're bringing in the cognitive science, you're bringing in the computer science, and then you're also bringing in the philosophy. And as someone studying moral philosophy, I'm curious about your take on what the role of philosophy is here. I know you've especially done some work with like Descartes and pushing back against some like Cartesian ideas, and we don't have to go too far down that rabbit hole. But I am curious, just like in general, where you see the role of philosophy in some of these conversations.
Yes, I do have some philosophy background. I do have a little bit of computer science background. I do have a cognitive science background. I do have a psychology background. But funny, I don't find myself as being a philosopher or a psychologist or a cognitive scientist, because I really am at the intersection of all these. Um, yes, and generally speaking, my work is more philosophical than anything, but I would still find it difficult to fit in, to take the label of philosopher, because the kind of philosophy I do is not really, doesn't fit well with your traditional Western analytic type of philosophy. It works in many respects, but for me it gets too abstract. It's too high up on a kind of constantly trying to generalize, or trying to find some generalizable rules. It really misses the particulars, the ground. That's where I find the philosophical thinking kind of inspired by, system science, embodied cognitive science, and in action, much more usable, much more practical. You are not philosophizing, or you are not trying to create some logical coherence to your thinking, but you really are talking about a particular incident, a particular event, and in a particular context. Context is always there. So in that sense, for me, that type of philosophy is really important, and it has a role in ethics. This is I know you have a question for me on my robot rights paper. So this is the kind of thing we also mention in the paper a little bit, because when you look at, the general field of AI ethics that is so heavily involved with robot rights, it really is up there, way too abstract. It's about what is intelligence, do thermostats have intentions? That sort of, to me, almost sounds a bit insane. And yeah, it's good to theorize. It's good to find clear logical coherence in your thinking. It's good to be rigorous. But when you are way far removed from actual happenings, you are actually doing more harm than good. This is how you end up arguing whether robots should have rights or not, when you actually have issues such as the very robots that we are discussing about are made by, they operate on the backbone of micro workers, people constantly tagging and labeling images. And also the whole conversation moves the discussion from what's happening on the ground. You have, for example, I think this was last year, a case where a wheelchair user was blocked by a Starship robot, and she couldn't get out of her way. And it should be those incidents, those actual events that we need to talk about, instead of whether a robot should have a right or not. So I guess this is another example of how philosophy is important, but too analytic, too far removed philosophical thinking that strives to find a unifying theory or some generalizable principles. Really, I don't see it helping in AI ethics, I think.
Well, I was just about to ask you, should robots have rights? But now I feel like I shouldn't ask that question. So maybe instead, a better question would be to ask, if we were to grant some sort of rights to robots, like pragmatically speaking, what would that look like? And what are some of the possible negative and positive outcomes of choosing certain scenarios over others?
To me, granting robots is just extending rights to companies, big tech companies, monopolies that already have rights. So by giving rights to their products, you are extending their rights to even further abrogate their responsibilities. Because on a philosophical level, there is no autonomous entity. Not at the moment. There might be in the future. There is no autonomous entity that can be granted rights. If you look at, the very components of how robots operate, even how machine learning systems work, because there is no actual clear definition that demarcates machine learning systems from robots. If you look at how those things operate, they are never just autonomous systems. They are always human-machine systems. So when we are talking about at a philosophical level, how intelligent a machine has to be in order to be granted rights, we really are removing the whole backbone, the human in the loop. That is maintaining, that is creating, that is making the operation smooth. So for me, as long as there is that, there is no, it's silly to talk about even the very idea of granting robots rights. But rather, it's much more important. If we think we are being ethical, if we think we are involved in ethics, then look at what is behind the scene. How much are, for example, Amazon's mechanical Turks, they are one of the lowest paid workers, and they are heavily involved in, when from tagging raw data to maintaining various, whether it's machine learning systems or robotic systems. So let's talk about, how are we maintaining their welfare? How are we protecting their health? And what systems do we have in place for them to have their rights, a comfortable life? So that's much more important. But also that is on a philosophical level. But when you then look at it from another level, what you find is what you find is robots and machine learning systems are actually tools that are being used to harm people. whether it's hiring systems, whether it's policing systems, or whether it's machine learning systems used in various spheres, what you find is the very development and deployment of those systems actually puts vulnerable people, poor people, marginalized people at a much higher disproportional harm compared to the status quo. So that's really the harm that's being caused by robots and machine learning systems is what we really need to talk about if we really are concerned about ethics. That's my position anyway.
One thing that we've heard from some other guests who are questioning the status quo is that they've received some pushback from industry or from other folks, even in the field. And I'm curious if you, especially around this topic of robot rights or centering marginalized voices, have received any pushback to your scholarship.
I haven't received any pushbacks from any notable industry or organizations. I am not that big. But when our paper came out, there was pushbacks, but from individual researchers who were really invested in robot rights. And I do sometimes wonder whether they actually really, those people who work to make robot rights a thing, whether they are missing the point of what they are advocating for, or whether they know and they are still, going ahead and working towards it. Because for me, it doesn't make sense to call yourself an ethicist if you kind of underplay or downplay the harm that's being caused by the deployment of these systems. So there was some pushback, especially on Twitter. It was a little frustrating, but also it gave our paper a lot of coverage. So not bad overall.
Do you see a relationship, or maybe a better word for that would be, do you see a similarity between the way that humans function and work in the world and the way that computers and algorithms function and work in the world, and have those two played into the way that you view ethics?
I think I can interpret your question on two levels. The first one is there is always we always exist, humans always exist in some relation with robotic systems or AI systems. So when I talk about, say, my phone or a robot system, it's a tool that humans have created that will extend my ability to do things, that will extend my cognition. But to think of that thing, that my phone or my robot, as something that can have its own right or that can extend its own existence, is to almost think of my right as having it's like talking about giving my right, my hand a right. So yes, robotic systems and AI systems exist in relation with humans, and they are part of our milieu, but they are not things in and of themselves that can be intelligent, that can be fully autonomous. And I think the second part of your question, I think if I got it right, is with the complexity of things and the fact that we exist in a relation of webs. So I think I'll talk. I have a recent paper coming out, so I'll use that as a reference and talk about that and see if I can clarify your point. So yes, coming from system science and embodied cog-sci, as I said earlier, you see human beings and the very idea of cognition fundamentally existing with others, always, in an indeterminable relationship with others. So, and also existing embedded in historical and cultural and societal norms. So any understanding of me requires all that is my background. So in a sense, if you follow the systems and the Koksai thinking, what you find is humans are always active, always moving, always changing, always adjusting to the situation, to the context. And there are infinite ways and different forms for me to be in my next step. I am indeterminable, because how I react or how I might behave next is really, because it's infinite ways. You really cannot say this is you and then you will act in this way in the next event or in the next future. And so that puts the very idea of human beings as really something you cannot predict, something that is contextual, something that's continually changing. But on the other hand, you have machine learning systems, especially those that try to predict social outcomes, whether it's in prison, whether it's in social welfare, or whether it's in social interactions. You have, every day almost you have this new system that is trying to predict outcome or a social outcome of some sort, and then what you find then is we are trying to employ machine learning systems to predict the inherently unpredictable. And in the process, even the very idea, even the very concept, the very attempt to predict something kind of carries the outcome forward. So by predicting something, you make it happen in a sense. And so when we are employing these machine learning systems, we are creating a certain type of future that resembles the past. And we really are narrowing possibilities and narrowing opportunities, especially for those that are disproportionately impacted. So I guess my embodied Koksai and systems background comes handy in kind of interrogating how the very idea of cognition and intelligence and learning is not something you define once and for all and pin down and then predict, because that's impossible, because we are complex adaptive systems, and that's the very definition of complex adaptive systems. And then when you are deploying these machines, what you find is you get into all sorts of ethical problems where you have discriminations, where you have disproportional harms, but also at a general level, you find the general discourse of trying to think of machines as a solution, as a quick fix, or as a way to formalize, or as a way to kind of narrow down and simplify what has usually been, difficult to define or difficult to understand. So we get into the habit of, or into this discourse of you thinking of machines as a quick fix, or as a way to almost liken them, to give them the ability of a god, because we are attempting the impossible just because we have mathematically based machine learning systems.
It does seem that a lot of people tend to really trust machine learning systems and machine learning decisions as if they are these divine predictions that are coming from this seemingly objective source in the world. And something that you mentioned that was really, I think, spot on is that machine learning systems are creating a future that resembles the past. And this really touches a lot on the note that the data that's fed into these systems is a reflection of the past. I know you've done a little bit of work on data and objectivity, and I'd love for you to shed a little bit of light on that idea and really whether you think data is objective or could be objective or not.
I think many people have been writing and speaking about this. Even the very idea of objective, subjective is reminiscent of Western philosophy and Western science. It comes from the thinking that you can put your intuitions, your background, your feelings and emotions aside, and you can look at the world from a totally detached perspective. But that's impossible because we are humans. We are not gods. We can't do that. So whether it's scientific investigations, whether it's data, the very idea of objective data or objective science really just reflects the status quo. Because when we think we are viewing something from a view from nowhere, in quotation mark, we really are adopting the status quo as the normal, as the standard, and we are measuring things from there. So the very distinction of objective and subjective is really problematic, and a lot of people from STS, I think, since decades back, have been speaking about this. But data, I'm involved in teaching here in Dublin in the data science module, and there is even, after so much work, you constantly find your students and people in data science in general thinking, data just exists out there, and you go and collect them, and you do your analysis, and then tada, you find your results. But that's far from the truth. You even the very beginning of asking a certain question instead of other questions, you are bringing your subjective interest, and when you select a certain data set, you are excluding others by definition, and data sets are never clean and never complete. You have to do so much massaging, so much cleaning of your data in order for your data to make sense, and you exclude some. You have missing values, so you somehow compensate for that, and all that involves the data science, the person itself doing all the cleaning and the analysis, and then how you want to interpret your results is also really reflects what your interests are, what you want to achieve. So the very idea of objective data really is, I think, that is so yesterday.
Absolutely. And I'm really taking to heart what you're saying about how sometimes even without thinking, we're grounding ourselves in these classic assumptions of like Western philosophy or Western understanding. And I was reading your blog post recently about the algorithmic colonization of Africa. And I was wondering if you could talk more about, I guess, the politics of place in all of this.
So that my blog on the algorithmic colonization of Africa came from, and it's I have written it into a paper, so it should also come out very soon. It came from this huge frustration again of people totally grossly overhyping the power of AI and totally misunderstanding to what extent it's a solution. Last year, I think in June, I was invited to one of the biggest conferences in Africa. It's called Sci-Fi Africa. At first, I was startled. I just couldn't believe I was invited there, because it was a lot of people from policy, government people from the royal family, regulators, a lot of UN ambassadors, and representatives of various big AI companies, tech companies, and a lot of AI researchers also were there. And I was super excited to be part of it. But as the day went on and as the conference progressed, it's just the same thing again and again and again. People would mention and bring up this state-of-the-art algorithm or state-of-the-art tool that has been used, I don't know, in Germany or in England or somewhere in the US, and they are bringing it to health services to some sub-Saharan countries, or they are importing, X and Y and Z to help various women in very small villages in various parts of Africa. And so I tried to be critical in a constructive way. But as the day went by, I was really frustrated because there was no ear for critical thinking. People were just too excited to be up, to leapfrog was the term that was overly used. Leapfrog the continent into development. I have also come to be super allergic to that word now. And for me, I'm not totally objecting the importing of various take into Africa, but my worry is that first of all, any take reflects the value and the interest and the problems of a certain society. So a take developed, say for example in England, really is developed for a certain purpose, with certain interest, with certain philosophical thinking background, with certain cultural norms. It's simply because there is the philosophy, the interest, the questions, the problems, the solutions totally vary. I know this from coming from Ethiopia to living in Ireland. I'm still trying to adjust to the culture shock. People think differently. People find different solutions. A problem that might be seen as critical here in England, for example, may not be a problem at all in some sub-Saharan country. So one of the issues for me was context matters. And the second one is when you are importing various take products, you really are importing, whether the take is going to be applied in banking or in finance. You really are bringing your ideal, your Western ideal, your thinking to be normalized, to be accepted as the standard. So that really resembled colonial power. But on a more cynical level is, if we are being frank, people that are exporting and importing take really have one interest, that is the accumulation of wealth. They want profit. They really don't care about, it's really not about the unbanked women of Africa. Can you imagine, a group of CEOs sitting at a round table in the US worrying about unbanked African women? I can't. So that article came out of frustration for a lack of critical voice when talking about technology in Africa. So I was attempting to kind of liken how the importing and exporting of Western tech really is a reincarnation of colonialism, but now it's in a digital form. And because everybody's hyped up, people are not questioning it as much.
So what do we do about that? Is there something that we can do? Like, how do we change our thinking? Do we have to just get rid of the whole system of colonization that's been embedded over the last, forever? Or what? Yeah. How do we address this?
Yeah. So, some people argue we are not over colonialism, and some people really object the very word post-colonialism because we are not past it. And can we import take without colonialism? No, because a lot of take is built. Colonialism is not a bug; it's the feature. So we can't. But for me, at least, I see a lot of African entrepreneurs, a lot of local experts working from the ground up. So for me, if people really want to help, if people want to do good, if they want to be involved, for me, the most straightforward thing to do is to support local experts, to support that is technology that is homegrown, that comes from the concerns of local problems, and that's one way forward. And but I know I said there was very little critical voice at the conference, but there still exists a lot of kind of critical voices throughout the continent. So you see them organizing in various ways. So seeing that organization also kind of gives me hope, and I see that is also a good future, a way forward. If anything fails, at least in bringing about awareness of the underlying implication and intention of Western technology.
And as we move towards the latter part of this interview, something that we do, Dylan and I do as part of this project, the Radical AI podcast, is we are working to define the word radical as it exists in the field of AI. And we are working towards a definition, but we're definitely very curious what you think that definition might be. So what the word radical means to you, and then, of course, how you situate yourself, your story, and your research in that definition.
As I mentioned earlier, my background is in embodied cognitive systems thinking. And from that perspective, you cannot define something once and for all. If you define radical AI or what radical means now, it only serves for now, because what's radical moves and changes in time with context. But I'm not saying we shouldn't define radical. I'm just saying it's a moving target. But I don't really have a definition of radical AI myself, but I have a definition from a friend of mine. You might have heard of her, Ria Kaluri. She's doing her PhD in Stanford, and she is creating a community of radical thinkers. So their definition of radical is radical work begins with a shared understanding that there is a root problem. Society distributes power evenly. Growing from these roots, radical AI examines how AI rearranges power and critically engages with the radical hope that our communities can dream up different human AI systems that help put power back in the hands of the people. So I think that's a good working definition. But again, it will, what is radical varies. So what is radical? So some people take my work as radical, and if you come from systems thinking or STS, you will find my work not that radical, but it would be radical for the AI crowd. And if you look at my AI work and I bring it to the systems thinking, the systems crowd will find it radical, but not so much the AI. So it really is what's radical really is contextual. But even given context and conditions, still some people for me stand out as doing radical work. One, as I mentioned, is Ria Kaluri. Radical work for her is all about shifting power from the most powerful to the least powerful. So this can happen, for example, by involving vulnerable people and people that are disproportionately impacted and harmed by AI into the decision-making position. By putting them at a key decision-making positions, then we shift the power. We give them more power to decide. The other one is Dan McQuillan. He's an experimental physicist by training, but the kind of work he does also, as far as I'm concerned, qualifies as radical. In especially his recent work on non-fascist AI, he likens the very idea of the AI project as something that aligns with radical right-wing thinking. He explains how AI has allowed for thoughtlessness. We stop being critical. We just adopt the next big thing. And he goes through all the characteristics of AI that very well aligns it with, a right-wing thinking. And for him, in order to get at, an ethical or social good AI, we really have to dismantle, we have to come to terms with the fact that AI as it is now something that aligns values with, radical left-wing thinking. And for him, we work from there. And by, organizing, by resisting, and by devising various methods and developing tools. And I guess I should mention another one is OSKIS. You might have heard of them. They have written one piece especially comes to my mind, which is Counting the Countless, which again questions the very fundamental idea of what data science is. For them, they were asked, I think they explain at the start of the piece, which is in Real Life magazine, it's called Counting the Countless. They were asked to give a talk on how data science can be used for good to help queer people and trans people. And they explain through the piece, and what they find is data science, the very existence of data science actually is a fundamental problem, is something that harms trans people, queer people, because queerness and being trans is contextual. And by, kind of pinning down a person in data points, you really force them into some sort of category. So data science in a way brings more harm than good. So that kind of work all qualifies. All that type of work, I think, is radical and something inspirational and very. It gives me vision and hope and yeah.
And of course, for listeners, we will include the names and links to those thinkers and some of those publications in the show notes for this episode. Abeba, as we look towards ending this interview, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to give us your own vision or hope, because there's a lot of folks that listen to this podcast who are just getting into this work and getting into these conversations. And if there's either one piece of advice or one particular vision you have of all of us coming together in this work, that would be wonderful.
I have just realized I have been super negative, so it's fair that I kind of outline some sort of hope and vision. Yes, as I said earlier, I have a paper coming out called In Defense of Indeterminability, and it's all about how machine learning systems are forcing and coercing determinability to and narrowing possibilities and creating a future that resembles the past. And towards the end of that paper, I outline a few kind of ways forward and aspects that give hope. And I guess one of them for me is we can talk about policy, we can talk about debiasing data sets, we can talk about various tools to combat surveillance systems. That's all good, but one central issue for me is one central thing vision for me is a system where radical work or work that empowers the least powerful is incentivized, where where we create a discourse or where it becomes the norm that doing AI work that might give you very little profit or no profit at all, because at the moment all AI is based on profit and efficiency. So an AI that puts all that objective of gaining as much profit and great efficiency aside, and something that strives to empower the least privileged and the most vulnerable. And it's not that we are lacking that. There are various people working on that, but we don't have a system that incentivizes, that encourages that. So my hope and my vision is for creating awareness and creating a system that makes that sort of work cool and that rewards that. I don't know if it's possible, but that's my hope.
Yeah, thank you for saying all that. And Abeba, now that we've reached the end of our interview, for all of our listeners, if they would like to engage a little bit more with your work or with your online presence, is there a best place for them to go for that?
Yes, I can put in my email address, and I'm also very active on Twitter. Yes, I am happy to interact and to discuss on Twitter as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for coming on for this conversation, Abeba. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great.
We again want to thank Abeba for coming on the show today. And coming out of this interview, I am feeling pretty challenged overall, especially on this concept of ethics in general. I think one of the most important set of questions that we started asking in the middle of the interview is whether ethics means anything anymore, or whether it's just a brand that we're putting out there. I think Abeba used the term, vacuous when she talked about removing #ethics from her Twitter bio. And for me, as someone who considers himself an ethicist, and for us as doing this podcast about AI ethics, that question of, what are ethics is so important. And I never want it to get to a point where we completely lose track of what is core in questions of ethics. But in order to do that, we all need to know what we mean when we're using the term ethics in the first place. And if it just becomes a corporate slogan or something about compliance, right, just in the legal field, then we have really lost the heart of the project. So I'm feeling challenged to figure out, how do we maintain standards and meaning and content in the bucket of ethics while we're having these conversations.
Dylan, I completely agree with you. I actually felt challenged quite a bit by this interview as well. First, in just questioning what the word ethics actually means, and then questioning what it means to be an ethicist, and asking myself if I am an ethicist. I know you said you label yourself as an ethicist, but I was remembering the first time that you and I did our very first welcome episode together, and you asked me if I considered myself to be an ethical person.
Oh, that's a good question.
And I didn't really know how to answer that question. And I think that as an ethicist, that is a really important question to be asking yourself, probably constantly. And Abeba kind of brought that up in this interview at one point. She was talking about the harm of universalism, and if we create ethical standards for things or for technology, and we just assume that one way can be the best way for everyone, that's super harmful. And I find myself questioning, first of all, if standardization is even possible in ethics, and if it is, what would that standardization look like? And am I even someone who is able to make a call like that, who's just working on AI and ethics, who considers myself maybe an ethicist, if I don't even really know what it means to be an ethicist, and if I don't even know if I consider myself to be an ethical person or not? I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts coming up around this topic, and it's definitely making me question quite a bit about the field of ethics as a whole.
A lot of really great existential questions, or ethics-central questions. That's pretty good. That
wasn't good.
That was great. So yeah, and then some other things based on what you're talking about that come to mind is when Abeba was talking about robot rights, and I never really considered myself a robot rights activist, but as someone who studies different types of intelligences and questions about general AI in the future and topics like that, I don't think I've ever really connected the topics of robot rights with capitalism and with the issues of capitalism, and how Abeba connected it with the rights of corporations, and really just being, if we think about robots as products, it being extensions of increased protection and legal support, essentially, for the corporations themselves. And that's something that I have, various thoughts about that I need to, I think more about before I share. But that, in terms of can this question of robot rights really just be, I think, as Abeba said, a reincarnation of colonialism in a digital form, is just such a pivotal question that I think really needs to be asked, and that's why it's so important that Abeba's interdisciplinary background is represented in these spaces, and why we have these conversations in the first place about social sciences and computer science coming together to have these conversations, because you need the historical background of colonization in order to really understand how even the questions of robot rights might be playing directly into historical systems of oppression.
Yeah, there's clearly a lot of topics that we still need a little bit of time to digest and to debrief together. But of course, we'll get much more deeper into this conversation in our mini-sode in a few weeks. And until then, for more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And as always, stay radical. It's good. I always like the delay on Zoom with the stay radical.
I don't think it was together for me. Do you consider yourself an ethicist, Dylan? Are you ethical?
No. two very different questions. I consider, I don't know. We should talk more about the ethics soup.
You wouldn't put ethics in your ethics soup?
I would not put ethics in. No, just more back to the carrots.